Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Puddcast with me, Jonathan Puddle. This is episode 41 with Allison Alley, who's the CEO and president-elect of Compassion Canada. You'll learn more about Compassion shortly. A couple of things I want to say before we get started. I've been deeply affected by the death of Rachel Held Evans last weekend, as I know many of you have, and so I wanted to just make mention of that and give honor to Rachel's legacy, to her family. Many of us have contributed to a GoFundMe for her family to help deal with some of the financial realities. And those of you who are grieving and are mourning Rachel's loss, it really seems that something kind of profound is happening for a lot of people, learning to grieve together and hold space together for someone who called so many of us to a higher faith and an honest and a deeper faith, one that we had wrestled with for ourselves. I had longed to have Rachel on the show, and I commend her books to you. She'll have one last book coming out posthumously next year. But a lot of words have been shared elsewhere, but I wanted to just quickly make mention of that before we got into this today. Also, regarding this interview today with Allison Alley, just last month was the 25th anniversary of the end of the Rwandan genocide, if you can believe, 25 years. I've got a connect group that meets in our home, connected with our church, and we've got a guy in our group who grew up in Rwanda and, lost his leg to a landmine as a child. Like, the stories you hear, real deal. This guy in my house every 2 weeks. Anyway, Compassion Canada do some amazing work around the world, including in Rwanda. And so just put that out there for you to remember and to pray. And I've listed in the show notes some resources that you can dig into about Compassion Canada, including the book that Allison mentions in the interview. So, enough from me. Here we go. Alrighty, everybody. Welcome back to the Puddcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm very excited to introduce to you... some of you, that's a silly thing to say. Some of you will already know this person. But anyway...
a very small amount of you.
There she is. She's here. It's Allison Alley, the CEO and president-elect of Compassion Canada. She's with me today. Thank you very much for joining me.
My pleasure, Jonathan. I am just delighted to be here with you.
So, Allison, you're coming into this leadership role. You've already been doing this for a while. Talk to us a little bit about what's new with you. What's your day-to-day? What are you working on right now?
Sure, absolutely. Well, so I am the president-elect at Compassion, as you said, and I have been with the organization for 6 years now, but approximately 1 year ago is when it was announced that I would be taking over and stepping in, I guess is a better way of saying it, as president and CEO when our long-standing leader retires in the fall. So Barry Slonwhite has been our president and CEO for almost 26 years, has been with the organization for 35 years. And as I said, he has decided that it is time for him to step aside and to allow someone else to step in and keep moving this organization forward. So that is a little bit about what's going on in my world.
Very cool. Talk to me a bit about Compassion. I must confess, I do not sponsor a child through Compassion. I sponsor 2 children through World Vision and 1 through Plan International. So
amazing.
This is your opportunity to pitch me right now.
Well, let me start by saying there is so much need out there. And so I celebrate all the organizations that are doing their part and, leveraging their area of expertise and interest to help those in need. And then I celebrate every single person who says, yes, I can help out. So I think it's great that you're supporting those organizations. Compassion is a global child development organization that exists to end poverty in the lives of kids and their families. So we work in 25 developing countries and partner with about 7,500 local churches who can then know, love, and protect children in their own communities. So as of today, we're serving over 2 million children. And what really makes compassion unique is not just that we are church-based, as I said, or child-focused, but we are Christ-centered. So we have what we call a holistic child development program, which very simply means we aim to serve the whole needs of the child. So we develop them not just physically, but socially, cognitively, and also spiritually.
That's cool. Yeah, I was aware that you worked through churches, which I know, sets you apart, but that's really cool. How did that get started? What's the kind of birthing of the concept?
Yeah. So we started in 1952 in Korea. So what would have happened then is an American evangelist named Everett Swanson was over in Korea to evangelize and witness to the troops that were there in the war. And as the story goes, one evening he was walking down the street and he encountered orphans of war. And it was a moment for him. Basically, one of these children took his coat and started running down the street. And he immediately just wanted justice, and started pursuing this child down the street, was angry, looking for his coat. And then all of a sudden, the child disappeared down an alleyway. And, he followed this child and then all of a sudden was stopped in his tracks and saw his coat sitting on the ground in kind of this doorway. And he kneeled down, picked up his coat, and realized that this child and a bunch of other children were lying under this coat just to stay warm. And so you can imagine in that moment, it really impacted him. But then even more so, the next day, he got up early, he was walking down the street, and he was going to go to that same doorway to look for these kids. And instead, he saw this army truck going down the street. And there were these soldiers that would come out that would kind of shake these rags and these articles of clothing along the street. And every once in a while, they'd pick something up, throw it in the truck, and keep going. And to his horror, as he got closer, he realized that they were checking to see who made it through the night and who didn't. And then they would take those lifeless bodies and cast them aside and keep going down the street. So as he came back home to America, he really felt God asking him the question, what are you going to do? What are you going to do about this? And in what I would call a divine appointment, he went home and faithfully told this story to one person. And that person said to them, likely through tears in their eyes, I can only imagine how this played out, but they pulled a blank check out of their pocket and said, God told me to carry this check. And when someone came to me to tell me about a desire to help the plight of orphans of war, I was to write this check. And so in that moment, Compassion's ministry was birthed by, donor and founder with the vision and heart to care for the needs of children. And of course, much has changed since that time and our program has advanced since.
Come on. That's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. So that's the founding of the U.S. Central kind of thing. Mm-hmm. How did it spread then into other nation operations?
Yeah, so we now have 13 what we would call partner countries that exist to raise awareness and ultimately to raise funds for the programmatic work that we do in these 25 countries. So some of the large ones would be Canada, US, Australia, UK, New Zealand, so on and so forth. Korea, interestingly enough, has moved from a programmatic country where we work there to develop children and their families to a funding country that now is one of our largest supporters in helping kids in other countries. So that's just an incredible story in and of itself. But Canada, to answer your question, started our office in 1963. And it was started with very, very humble roots by a couple that was sponsoring a child through the U.S. office and just wanted to engage more significantly in the cause. At the time, our head office was in Chicago. So they drove to Chicago, called a meeting with the leader at the time, and said, hey, we're only two people, but we are sponsoring a child and we believe in what you do. Would you consider moving into Canada and maybe we can help you get started? And at the time they said, well, we can't formally yet move into that country. We'd be happy to resource you if you start your own organization and, we can partner together. And so this couple started Compassion of Canada is what it was called at the time out of their basement and spent time just going on the road, sharing Compassion's story and, sponsoring one child at a time.
That's wild. That's only
Hmm.
that's only what 50 some years ago.
That's right. Yeah.
And today I did not pull up your financial statements, so I can't pull this number. But you guys certainly there's got to be thousands in Canada alone that you're of children being sponsored.
Yes. Yeah. So we raise about $65 million a year and have arguably close to about 100,000 supporters in this country.
Incredible. And how many children
Hmm.
then are being sponsored?
Yeah, about 115,000 by Canadians.
Oh, right, because I guess it's a 1-to-1 generally. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Oh man, that's wild. That's so cool. Oh, I love that. How did you get then into compassion? What's your journey into the organization?
Oh, Jonathan, how long do we have?
All the time you need. My children will eventually come home from school and will stomp around the house, and then it gets noisy. But
You know what? That's going to happen on my end too. So we will just extend lots of grace to one another. Okay, so my story, it's funny, I lived through it. And every time someone asks the question, I still go, wow, yeah, how did I get here? And the easy answer, not dissimilar to the story I told you about the birth of our organization, is in hindsight, you would say it was all of these divine appointments where God was bringing people into my path to mold me and shape me and move me forward to where he had me. More specifically, my story is that I worked in the marketplace. So I was in the finance industry and, was really, really enjoying working with a wide variety of business people and families on their investments and their lending. And in hindsight, I very, very slowly moved away from what I knew was God's calling and purposes for my life, which he revealed very early to me when I went to a discipleship training program at Youth with a Mission. And God used that program to speak very clearly that my life would be marked by living on mission and by living a life that cared for children and the poor. But here I was instead 10 years later and not fully living that out. So I had what would be this kind of wake up moment where in particular God used my own children to really remove my blinders and my barriers in my life and to bring me back to this renewed sense of calling and purpose. And so I remember one day in particular, Jonathan, I was sitting in my basement holding my youngest daughter, who was about 6 months at the time, and looking at my husband and my 2.5-year-old and just becoming, unglued. I just was overwhelmed with emotion. And that's not typical of me and how I'm wired. And I remember thinking, this is so unusual because I have everything that I've ever wanted. I had a successful career. My husband and I had renovated a beautiful home by the lake in Niagara. I was happy in my marriage, healthy kids, a strong, vibrant community around me. And what I realized in that moment is that I had been working so hard to give my kids everything they ever wanted and more than they could ever need, while completely ignoring the needs of other kids around the world. And more than that, as a mother, it was almost this instant burden for other moms around the world who just wanted their kids to survive, never mind thrive. And so for my husband and I, there was this opening up of our hands and our hearts to say, God, all that we are is yours. All that we are headed towards and the path in front of us is yours. Would you lead us and guide us like never before? And so very quickly, within a few weeks, we put our house up for sale. And there was what we called this out of the boat experience, where we recognized that we created a pretty stable and safe life for us that did not require us to trust God. And that in many ways separated us from the reality that we felt like he was calling us to walk towards. So we put our house up for sale, having no idea what would happen next. Ended up moving into my parents' house because our house sold very quickly. And again, this is where the divine appointments come in. But ultimately, my husband had the opportunity to travel with our church to Ecuador and to learn about the work that one of our church's new partners was doing there. And that new partner was Compassion Canada. And while he was there, he fell in love with the ministry of compassion, and they surprised him by allowing him to meet our sponsor child. Because right before this trip, we said, hey, let's sponsor a child through this organization. We know very little about them, but in this renewed sense of calling, let's take one faithful step and sponsor one child. Well, this encounter for him in meeting our sponsor child, Jimmy, just rocked his world. And he came back and said to me, Allison, I think that compassion is the vehicle by which we will live out this calling to be advocates for kids and the poor. Wow. Now, at the time we were living 2 hours away from the compassion office. I remember literally saying to my husband, I'm like a washed up banker. What would they want with me? And so we started volunteering.
Let me just pause you for a moment there, because every photo that I've seen of you is this beautiful, joy-filled, vibrant face that does not sound like a washed-up banker. So for those of you who haven't yet Googled Allison Alley because you're doing your laundry while you listen to this podcast, don't believe everything she has to say. Continue.
It's fair. It turns out I'm not that old. And at the time, I may not have had enough life experience to be as washed up as maybe I felt at the time. So perhaps that's fair.
But you felt fair enough. Your experienced reality was real, yes.
Yeah. So, as we were on this journey, there was this pivotal appointment where a pastor from our church, who was being a sounding board and mentor to us at the time, as we discovered what this path would look like for us, said, you know what? I know the director of marketing at Compassion, and I think, he would be a great sounding board and just someone who understands missions, understands child poverty, could maybe help guide you. And as we sat in front of him and told him this story, he would tell you in hindsight, he felt like very clearly that God was calling our family to vocational ministry at Compassion. And in fact, at the time, Compassion Canada was looking to launch their advocacy ministry, which would be focused on how to really equip and empower the church in Canada to live on mission and to care for children and the poor. And he felt like, God, I believe that you are calling this family to get this started. It took a while for me to catch up to God's plans and to figure out, yes, this was of God. But this whole journey was probably about 9 months in its entirety before I said yes to Compassion and started working part-time remotely from home, launching their advocacy ministry.
Wow. That's fascinating. There's a lot of interesting touch points there that I can totally relate to. Even, going on a DTS with YWAM, I was a YWAM kid growing up. My parents hauled me and my brother all around the world, teaching Toymaker and Son teams. So yeah, that's fun.
Wow.
And then, that safety thing of like creating a world where you don't have to actually trust God. Isn't that just burn? It's like, my wife and I were living in Finland, and we had moved there. We had, for her to do a master's, and things were wonderful. We had kids. We had amazing community. We had all this stuff around us. We felt like we were living the dream. Yeah. And then God was sort of like, would you come back to Canada if I promised you nothing? And
amazing.
I remember, wrestling with it. Like you said, it took you a while to come around to Compassion. I remember wrestling with that. And one day God said, you know what, son, if you'd like, you could stay here and live a safe life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like he knew exactly which button to press.
Yeah.
I do not want my tombstone to say, Jonathan Puddle, he lived a safe life.
And boring. Let's add that in parentheses.
Yeah, well, exactly. There it is.
And Jonathan, I would say, fast forward to today. And one of the things that always strikes me as I travel around the world and encounter those who, socioeconomically are quite different than me, and in many ways we would say have less or not enough, are so rich in their faith. And there's a wide variety of reasons that we could attribute that to: their sense of community, the richness of their dependence on God. But it is that piece of going, they need to rely on God for their literal daily bread and rely on the church and community around them to give what they have to one another in ways that I think grows your faith and grows your sense of community that we just don't often experience here in the Western world.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you know Laura Solberg?
Yes, I do. I'm on a board with her.
Laura was my first guest on this podcast.
Oh my goodness.
And so we talked about that nature of poverty and of us so often easily in the West thinking that we have much and they, whoever they is, have little.
Right.
And so she was sort of helping me see, breaking down poverty into an understanding of broken relationships, right? And so there's relationships between man and man, between man and nature, between God and man, all these different bits and pieces, and how we in the West often have an extreme poverty of community, sometimes of spirituality, of communal reliance. And yet our wealth can be a blessing to others just as much as we can then be blessed by having our eyes opened to see just how poor we are compared to the people that we would consider, the other.
Mm-hmm. The way that compassion often talks about it is we would say that the opposite of poverty is not wealth, but enough or sufficiency. And to your point, when we get to often what can come with wealth, though not always, but is this sense of pride or ego or a self-dependency, isolation, individualism, materialism, consumerism, a separation from God. As you said, this poverty in relationship with self and others and God and the created world around us. And, without recognizing that, we can absolutely impart our thinking and our ways on those who are living in economic poverty and think what they need is what we have. And in actuality, what we all need is to experience shalom and sufficiency and fullness in Christ and richness of community. And I think in order for us to get there, we need one another. We need to be in community and relationship with people who are different than us so that we can then discover our own blinders and barriers and potentially be confronted with our own deficits as we see surprising assets and gifts in other people. And there's a lot we could talk about there, but this sense of sufficiency, and it's not about wealth or affluence, is really significant to understand.
Can you expand maybe your thoughts on that concept of shalom? I've been reading more and more and seeing that word crop up more as kind of an indicator that it's more than just like, well, I feel good and I'm okay, but like true shalom requires something broader. Yeah.
Well, I don't know that I'll answer this question directly, but when I think about shalom, I often think about the beginning. And I think about the fact that God created a world where poverty could not exist. It was a world where Adam and Eve had no need. And to your point about relationships, they were in this perfect relationship with God, this perfect communion with one another. They had an appropriate identity of self as a child of God and a perfect relationship with the created world around them, right? And it wasn't until sin entered the world that those relationships got broken. And so when I think about shalom, I think back to the sense of wholeness and harmony and completeness, which was in place and part of the created order. That, of course, as we know, we will not experience fully this side of heaven. But I think it's important to understand the complexity and how far-reaching shalom and wholeness is as Christians, so that as we move forward and long to live on mission and carry out God's mission, we recognize the holistic nature of God's mission. And that as we talk about engaging in the world around us and this pursuit of shalom, it is for this wholeness in sense of self and community and created world around us and our relationship with God.
Yeah, amen.
Mm-hmm.
So you were brought on then to sort of help this transition, this advocacy, helping Canadians in the church live on mission.
Yeah.
What were some of your principles there, and what happened? Has that been successful?
It's funny because as you said that, I kind of swallowed hard and thought, wow, I was brought on board to help the church live on mission. How do you do that? I'm not
Seriously,
sure.
I'm glad somebody's helping us.
And who am I to say that I can help, the church? But so let me give more context there. There was a recognition for us as an organization that really what we are is a church equipping organization. What we do around the world is, in part, we envision local churches to understand their sense of calling and purpose to engage the community around them. And of course, particularly for us, we help them understand the value of children. And so that vision for children is really important in all of our church partnerships in the context of the developing world. But then what we do is we just equip and train the church to be the church, for them to, from an asset-based development perspective, you could say, to understand the assets and the resources that they have, to understand the assets and the resources in their own community, and how they can leverage both of that to meet people's needs. Now, of course, when we say that, what we mean is primarily focusing on discipleship, right? And really having effective evangelism strategies for children and their families in the community, but then to develop them wholly, as I said, socially, cognitively, physically, and to do so in a way that impacts quite significantly families and children around them. And so we started recognizing that we believe in the church. We believe that the church is God's chosen instrument to bring healing and hope in communities all over the world. And we also recognize that, as we just talked about, poverty and brokenness is not just an issue over there or in the lives of the other, but is very much an issue here at home. And so we wanted to do what we could to transfer our theology and our philosophy that the church has that key role in making an impact in communities and society, and to do what we could to envision the church in Canada to that end and to resource them. So practically what that looked like.
Yeah, sorry, so that is the focus then in that to encourage those churches within their own local context, or is it for those churches to, go and do mission trips, or kind of where does that?
Yeah, so the focus was local first and then global. So we believe that the church is called to their local neighbors first. And of course, the work that we do does have a global focus. But again, when we start talking living on mission in our daily lives, it does have that both and, needs here and needs around the world focus. So practically speaking, we started creating some resources. So we created a family resource called Step Into My Shoes, which is a way for parents or for teachers or Sunday school leaders to really help kids understand the needs around the world, and to help kids understand what's in their hand that God can use to help them make an impact. And then we did a similar thing for youth groups and then for adults. The adult one released most recently, and it's actually how you and I met, you'll remember, but it's called Eyes to See, Reflecting God's Love to a World in Need. And it is very much this self-inventory to understand what we have, where we have needs, the challenges and opportunities in our own backyard, and how God is calling us to be his hands and feet at a local and global level.
So good. So good. I love even obviously the journey and the statement that's what needed to grow within compassion, and that you were the person brought on to spearhead that. And then that's the same values actually that we need to lead this organization. That's just fantastic.
Absolutely.
I love that.
Absolutely.
How has that leadership transition been for you?
I will tell you, I feel incredibly blessed, honored. I'm not sure I have a word for it yet, to be a part of such a methodical, prayerful, well-planned transition. I think so often in the church, in the parachurch, in the marketplace, when you talk about senior leadership transitions, it's not uncommon for them to be abrupt, unexpected, for the new leader to often feel ill-equipped, ill-prepared, thrown into something they don't fully understand or have the time to understand. And that has just absolutely not been the case for me and at Compassion. So Barry, to his credit, started thinking about and planning for his retirement close to a decade ago.
Wow.
Yes.
That's remarkable.
So isn't it incredible? His background, so he was a senior pastor and really brought that pastoral perspective into his CEO role over the decades. And so he had firsthand encounters and experiences and conversations with other leaders, as I said, who just did not have a good transition experience. And so he decided early on that that was not going to be the case at Compassion, and that the organization and the mission mattered too much for him to not take this seriously. And quite frankly, there is risk involved in talking about your exit too soon. And my guess would be that that is why a lot of leaders don't engage in such an intentional plan early on, is because the second they start talking to their elders or their board or their senior leadership team about their exit, there can be a sense that maybe they're done now. Right. And there can be energy around their departure earlier than they intended or what is right for the organization. But Barry said, I'm not going to lead in fear. I'm going to talk openly and trust that God's will be done. And he started engaging with mentors and leaders around him in the marketplace and in ministry to really understand, the appropriate steps in succession. He created a white paper and gave it to our board maybe about 8 years ago now that talked about what those steps would be. And then he executed. They executed together. And so at a certain step along the way, through all of it, it was God's will, not ours, that we are looking to seek nothing more, nothing else, nothing less than the will of God for this organization. And that is all that I've experienced since I've been a part of it. But a few years ago, they started mapping out what are the characteristics that we are looking for, not who, but what first. And so they built a pretty comprehensive list of hard and soft skills, experiences, style. They did the hard work of saying, where is the organization? Where are we headed? And what do we need to get us there? And then they spent time saying, do we have anyone internal that might fit that bill? This was several years ago, because of course it takes time sometimes to mold and shape people into that role. But very early on, they decided, and rightfully so, that they would not contain their search just internally, but for the sake of the organization, they would do a thorough national external search. And so what happened as far as my part of the journey is at a certain point, Barry met with every single leader. So we had about 13, 14 leaders at the time, and basically said, what do you think we need in a new leader? And tested some of the board's thinking around hard and soft skills and characteristics. And then he asked them the question, is there anyone internally that we should be talking to? So he had this conversation. He met with me last. So I remember Barry looked at me. I haven't shared this very often. And he kind of smirked and put his pen down. And he said, so what would I tell you if like a large portion of the leaders that I met with said you? and I think, I have a very good relationship with Barry, and we banter back and forth. I think I said, well, I think they were crazy. And, we kind of laughed and it was kind of a, no, really. And it was a quiet moment. And I said, well, then I guess I would open up my heart and hands once again, not dissimilar to me coming to Compassion. And I would keep, if God is leading me down this path, then I will be open to that. So that was kind of where it picked up for me. And that, as I said, was the spirit for my husband and I. Had an incredible community around me at the time. that was speaking in, because I really wanted to test and affirm God's will through those who know me and know the organization. And I just was not interested in a position for a position's sake if it was not absolutely clear that it was the will of God. There's just too much at stake for the organization and, of course, for my family. But we would say, the board and Barry and myself, that it was confirmed over and over again, and was a deeply spirit-led journey and decision for us.
So cool. That's wonderful. Do you have a sense of some of your some real values or cultural things that you're bringing to the fore, that you're maybe driving forward for the organization?
Yeah. So when I think about, there's an internal and external perspective. And, anytime I talk about, what I bring or where we're headed, especially in this season of transition, I want to be clear. Sometimes people can hear, okay, we are then course correcting, or where we've come from, what was wrong, and therefore we need something different. And Barry and I know that that is not true. And we have this strength of trust and respect for one another that he often says, Allison, just, say it how it is. Where do we need to go? But I do want to articulate that here, that, there are these seasons of leadership, aren't they? Where, organizations and communities, companies need different styles and skills and structures and strategies, to be able to accomplish the goals that they have in that season and the one that's coming. And so in many ways, Barry grew this organization. I think we had about 1,000 sponsored children when he started. And so we have now grown to 110,000 sponsored children under his leadership. Wow. So he has just done a remarkable job building, the structure and the policies and the processes and the best practices to get us where we are. As far as what I bring, to answer your question, the type of leader that I am is highly relational. I love to work alongside my staff. So it's not uncommon that staff will come into my office and just kind of want to blue sky and vision, whiteboard or draw, and just think about, the opportunities in front of us. So I'm very engaged at that level. I'm a communicator and a speaker that's actually very similar to Barry. So I really love teaching our staff, coaching our staff. I like representing the organization externally through conversations like this, Jonathan, and, getting in front of different audiences and sharing the message that God has on my heart. I love strategy and research. I am Strength Finders, a learner, number one, and also input. So these are people that like to wrestle through concepts and ideas and challenge their thinking. And so what the staff are realizing now is that I really have a strong drive for excellence and to make research-based decisions, to challenge our thinking, to always ask the question, why? Okay, so we are doing this, but why? Because we always have, but why? So I am really bringing a focus on research, strategy, driving together in more integrated, coordinated ways than maybe we have in the last few years. Those are some of the things internally. Externally, I feel like the vision that God has placed on my heart and on the heart of our leadership team is, every child, every Christ follower, both lives transformed. So while organizationally we are serving 2 million kids living in poverty, it is not lost on me that there are 400 million children living in extreme poverty, 1 billion children living in poverty, which the World Bank defines as under $5.50 a day. So while compassion alone is not at all obviously going to reach every single child on our own, we want to do what we can to work towards a world where every single child can live a life free from poverty and can reach their full potential in Christ. And if that means that we partner with like-minded organizations, you mentioned too at the onset of this podcast, so we can get kids on the agenda, and we do that. So I have a really strong value on partnership. This all Christ followers, I'm really passionate about getting every single Jesus lover in this country living their faith in action, which inherently means to me prioritizing people living in poverty. And as I said, I believe that God calls us theologically to care for the needs in our own backyard and to steward the resources that he has given us, be it financial resources, time, talent, influence, power, education, to make an impact on those who don't have those things. And so to me, there is this inherent global calling that we have as Christ followers. And this both lives transformed piece for me and for us as an organization is that I really, and you'll see this reflected in some of the resources that we've been putting out. If you read Eyes to See, for example, this is not about us helping them. This is not about the rich helping the poor from my perspective, but this is about all of us coming together to recognize that we all have gifts, we all have needs. We therefore need one another, and to effectively steward all that we are and all that we have for God's purposes, and for us to draw closer to him and to closer to being transformed into his image in the process. So if compassion in all humility can play one tiny role in being a bridge between Christ followers in this country and children and families around the world, and if we can foster a mutual relationship and foster growth between these individuals and be a vehicle that God uses, man, oh man, do I want to be open to that.
Come on. Well, I feel inspired sitting here.
Oh, good. Good.
That's awesome.
It's exciting, isn't it?
Come on. Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It's so good. I love it. Allison, would you pray for us?
You bet. You bet. God, what a gift it is just to be a part of your community and to be entrusted with joining you in furthering your mission of justice and compassion across this country and around the world. God, I just pray for your church. I pray for your church in Canada. I pray for your church in every pocket around the world, that God, we would continue to seek your will for our lives and for the communities around us. God, would you help our hearts and our minds to be in tune with you? Would you help us to open up our hands and to see all that you have entrusted us with renewed clarity, a renewed sense of purpose. And God, as we walk forward in our daily lives, would our habits and our daily going reflect your purposes for the communities that we live in and those we interact with on a daily basis around the world. God, we long to be vehicles of your love and your justice and your compassion in our daily going. And we surrender our lives to you and ask that it would be done. In Jesus' name, amen.
You've been listening to the Puddcast with me, Jonathan Puddle. Thank you so much for tuning in. I believe that life is meant to be lived abundantly and with great freedom. I believe that love is meant to be powerful and to accomplish things in our life and the lives of those around us. So I quit my job, I started podcasting, I write a blog, I'm on social media, and I would love your support. I try to keep all sponsorship out of this show so that the content and the goodness can make its way to you unimpeded. But it's a lot of work and it's a lot of time, and I've got mouths to feed. If you have enjoyed this, would you consider joining me on Patreon? I'm at patreon.com/Jonathan Puddle. You can also find me at jonathanpuddle.com, where I write articles and so on. Just for as little as $3 a month, it'll help me keep this going and keep it ad-free, so we can keep discussing the depth of a rich life imbued with the goodness of God. Thanks so much for hearing me out. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you can tune in next week for another amazing guest. God bless you guys.